Now, folks, you are already familiar with an ILS approach. You're familiar with a localizer approach, and you're even familiar with their backward cousin, the localizer backcourse approach. And you know that there's one thing that all of these have in common. They're electronic funnels that guide you right in on the center line of the runway. Well, there's another type of approach that does use a localizer to guide you to the runway, but this time it does not aim you down the center line stripe. It comes in at an angle, and it's called an LDA approach, or a localizer type directional aid. Let's take a look at one of these, and to do that, let's go to the LDA Alpha approach for New York's LaGuardia Airport, and it uses the same normal width and accuracy. All LDAs are like that. It even uses the same identifier as a regular approach. It uses an I with the three-letter identifier, and it even uses the same symbol on the chart. But the significant difference is that an LDA approach always comes in at an angle of more than 3 degrees to the runway. Now, some folks remember that distinction by calling an LDA approach a localizer darn angle approach. Now let's take a look at the airport sketch and you'll see what I'm talking about. Although this approach is the runway 22, the final approach course for the localizer is 234 degrees rather than, say, 220 degrees. And you can visually see how the approach comes in at an angle to the runway center line. Now, they use LDA approaches when they want the accurate course guidance of a localizer, but maybe there's obstacles in terrain that prevent the localizer from being lined up with that runway center line. Now, really, the only difference between an ILS approach and a localizer approach and an LDA approach is that angle. Otherwise, it can be exactly the same. For instance, let's take a look here at Roanoke, Virginia, to the LDA Runway 6 approach. Now, this approach has everything an ILS does. It has a glide slope, it has outer and middle markers, it has DME on the localizer frequency. You name it, this approach has got it. But as you can see from this plan view, the big difference is it just doesn't happen to line up with Runway 6. And that'll be even more obvious if you take a look at the airport sketch down here. You notice the localizer symbol is actually off to the side of the runway. In fact, if you continued on your approach course, you'd probably wind up in the airport coffee shop instead of on the runway. So I guess if the food's any good in the coffee shop, you plan to fly this approach a lot, you just might keep a copy of the menu in the cockpit just in case. By the way, it's not common that an LDA does have a glide slope. Some do, but most don't. So there's a big note here in the plan view to let you know that this approach does have a glide slope. And they also let you know the same thing down here in the minimum section. They tell you, in fact, that this has a glide slope. Now, we've already established that the transmitter for an LDA approach does not necessarily have to be lined up with the runway, but surprisingly enough, it doesn't even have to be at the same airport. Let's take a look at this. Here's an LDA Charlie approach to Van Nuys, California, and if you look at this approach, you notice that it uses the Burbank localizer. Where's Van Nuys? Well, take a look underneath the outer marker symbol. You'll see the runways for Van Nuys. The approach comes in like this, almost exactly a 90-degree angle to the runway. You can see that angle even better if you look at the airport sketch down here. Here's the course arrow. There's the runway. How's that for an angle to your runway? Now, when you're flying an LDA approach, you aren't going to be surprised with anything you haven't already seen. After all, it is a localizer, and you have flown localizers backwards and forwards. But what you should look out for is, since the localizer comes into the runway at an angle, you won't find the runway directly in front of you when you break out of the clouds. So you'll want to study your approach chart in advance so you know whether to look to the left or to the right to find that runway. Now, once you find that runway, it's just a case of being prepared to do a little maneuvering when you break out of those clouds so you can line yourself up with that runway center line. Well, all right, super pilot, you've got the LDA approach all figured out. So let's take a look at another unusual approach, the SDF approach, otherwise known as a Simplified Directional Facility approach. Now, this particular approach plate we're looking at right here is for the SDF approach to runway 36 at Lebanon, Missouri. Now, an SDF approach uses a guidance system similar to a localizer, and that's why you see a symbol similar to a localizer here in this plan view. But notice there is no shading on either side of it. Also notice there's no I in front of the three-letter identifier. Those things let you know that this is not quite a real localizer. Now, the distinguishing characteristic of an SDF approach is that the course width is either 6 degrees or 12 degrees. And by the way, that course width is set at the time of the transmitter installation, and you, the pilot, have no control over it. Now, although SDF actually stands for Simplified Directional Facility, you can think of that S in SDF as standing for sensitivity, because it's not as sensitive as a localizer course. Now, you tune and fly an SDF just as if it were a regular localizer. And since it uses a simpler and less sensitive antenna system, it's actually cheaper to install and maintain than a localizer, and that's why you will see them. Now, an SDF approach can have marker beacons, but it will not have a glide slope. And that's because it's not accurate enough to allow you to descend as low as a glide slope would permit and still keep you free of obstacles and terrain. Now, normally the SDF will be lined up with the runway, and it will not be offset by any more than 3 degrees from the runway center line. For instance, if you take a look at this airport sketch, you can see the approach course is 359 degrees. In this particular case, you're landing on runway 36, so you're very well lined up with that runway. However, the approach course could be at a slight angle to the runway, so you might be doing a slight turn at the end of the approach. Now you fly in SDF approach the same way you've been flying localizers, but due to their lesser sensitivity, you just can't expect to see that runway perfectly centered in front of you when you break out of the clouds. Now, LDA and SDF approaches are much less common than ILS and localizer approaches, but they do make more accurate approaches available at some airports where you'd otherwise have to do with much less sensitive approach guidance.